An arrogant and powerful man abandons his elderly father in his wheelchair on the banks of a river, slowly sinking into the mud, amidst the sounds of the bayou with alligators approaching. Prayer was the only thing he had left to understand why, until the unexpected happened and changed everything from then on. If you also believe in the transformative power of stories that touch the heart and challenge the soul, subscribe to this channel now so you don't miss any narrative that could change your perspective on life. Jarasine rain fell like tears from the sky over the Louisiana bayou that March night, the dark waters reflecting only a waning moon and the gleaming eyes of alligators drifting silently among the water hyacinths. The monotonous sound of the rain was broken by the roar of a powerful engine, a heavy-duty American pickup truck, black as the night itself, advancing along the gravel road that snaked through the wetlands. Inside the luxurious vehicle, two men shared a silence as heavy as lead. In the driver's seat, Ethan Cole, 48 years old, kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his fingers gripping the steering wheel with a force that betrayed his inner tension. He wore an expensive tailored suit, even at that late hour, his dark hair perfectly combed, contrasting with the hard expression that dominated his angular face. In the passenger seat, a frail figure breathed with difficulty. Arthur Cole, 81 years old, founder of the largest real estate empire in the state, seemed a shadow of the powerful man he had once been. His completely white hair was disheveled, and his pale skin revealed the effects of months of intensive medical treatment. A dry, persistent cough escaped his chapped lips every few minutes, while his trembling hands clutched an already stained handkerchief. Where are we going, son?" The old man's voice came out as a hoarse whisper, breaking the tense silence that hung in the vehicle's air conditioning. Ethan didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the muddy road, where the tracks of other vehicles had already been erased by the incessant rain. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a coldness that violently contrasted with his father's evident vulnerability. "To a place where you'll no longer be a burden to anyone." The words cut through the air like a sharp blade. Arthur felt his heart race, not from the illness consuming him, but from the icy tone in the voice of the son he had raised with so much love and sacrifice. He tried to turn to face him, but the weakness in his muscles prevented him from making any sudden movements. The pickup slowed as they reached a clearing on the banks of a bayou channel, where the dark water stretched like a black mirror under the rain. Ethan parked the vehicle with calculated precision, turned off the engine, and remained motionless for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity. The sound of the rain drumming on the metal roof created a melancholic symphony that seemed to announce what was to come. "Ethan, please explain to me what's happening." Arthur's voice trembled not just from his illness, but from the growing fear that began to settle in his chest. "I'm scared, son." For the first time during the entire trip, Ethan turned to face his father. His dark eyes, which had once shone with childish admiration when the old man taught him about construction and business, now reflected only a calculated hardness. For a few seconds, father and son looked at each other in silence, and Arthur saw reflected in his son's face a cruelty he had never imagined possible. "You've become too expensive to maintain, Dad. The treatments, the medications, the private nurses, all of it is consuming a fortune I could be investing in the company's growth." Ethan spoke with the same coldness with which he discussed financial spreadsheets in his business meetings. "Besides, your condition will only get worse. The doctors were clear about that." Arthur felt as if a dagger had pierced his chest, not because of the bleak outlook on his health that he had already accepted with the resignation of someone who had lived a long and full life, but because of the brutal revelation of the character of the man in whom he had placed all his hopes and dreams. "Ethan, I built all of this for you. Every brick, every contract, every sacrifice I made was with your future in mind." Tears began to stream down the old man's wrinkled face, mixing with the rain blowing in through the partially open window. "How can you talk to me like this?" The businessman got out of the vehicle without answering, walked around to the passenger side, and opened the door with mechanical movements. The rain immediately soaked his expensive suit, but he seemed not to notice. With a strength that surprised even himself, he helped his father out of the truck and supported him to a wheelchair he had brought in the truck bed. Arthur, even in his weakened state, could perceive the cruel irony of the situation. The wheelchair, that should have represented mobility and independence, now became the instrument of his abandonment. His trembling hands tried to grip his son's arm, but Ethan pulled away abruptly. "Please, Ethan, for everything we've ever been to each other." The old man's voice was lost amidst the sounds of the rain and the distant croaking of frogs in the swamp. "I'll forgive you for all of this if you just take me back home. We can talk, find a solution." Ethan pushed the wheelchair a few yards towards the edge of the wetland, where the ground gradually became softer and more unstable. The light from the truck's still-on headlights illuminated the scene dramatically, creating long shadows that danced with the movement of the rain. "There is no solution, Dad. You're too sick to recover and too expensive to maintain. This is a purely business decision." Ethan spoke the words as if he were concluding a business meeting, his voice devoid of any recognizable human emotion. "Someone will find you in the morning, or maybe not. Either way, you won't be my problem anymore." The businessman returned to the truck without looking back, completely ignoring the moans of supplication coming from the wheelchair. He started the engine with mechanical movements, reversed out of the clearing, and accelerated back down the muddy road, leaving only tire tracks that would soon be erased by the incessant rain. Arthur remained alone in the damp darkness of the bayou, his wheelchair slowly sinking into the waterlogged ground. Around him, the nocturnal sounds of the region seemed to intensify, the croaking of frogs, the rush of moving water, and occasionally, the sinister sound of something large moving in the dark water, probably the alligators that gave the region its dangerous reputation. But what pained the old businessman's heart most was not the fear of predators or exposure to the elements. It was the bitter understanding that he had failed as a father, that the loving boy he had raised had transformed into a man capable of such cruelty. As the rain washed away his tears, Arthur began to pray, not for physical salvation, but for divine understanding of where he had gone wrong in raising his son. The hours dragged on slowly as the storm continued to batter the bayou. Arthur felt the damp cold penetrating his fragile bones, and his breathing became increasingly labored. Several times, he considered trying to get out of the wheelchair and drag himself to the road, but his debilitated physical condition made any movement an almost impossible task. It was then, in the early hours of the morning, as the rain finally began to lessen in intensity, that he heard a sound different from the natural noises of the swamp. It was the rhythmic sound of oars cutting through the water, accompanied by low voices conversing in English with the typical Cajun accent of the region. A small rustic fishing boat emerged from the morning mist, guided by three people who seemed to know every inch of those dangerous waters. At the bow, a woman of about 73, with grey hair tied in a simple bun and practical clothes suitable for work on the river, held a kerosene lamp that faintly illuminated the vessel. "Mama, there's someone over there on the bank," said one of her sons, a middle-aged man with hands calloused from a lifetime of working with fishing nets. The family matriarch, known in the region simply as Mama Rosie, directed the lamplight to where her son had pointed. What they saw left them simultaneously shocked and outraged. An elderly man in a wheelchair, completely soaked and shivering from the cold, clearly abandoned in a situation of extreme danger. "Lord have mercy," Mama Rosie murmured, quickly making the sign of the cross. What kind of person does something like this to an old man? Without hesitation, the family steered their boat towards the bank. What would happen in the next few hours would forever change the lives of everyone involved in this extraordinary story of abandonment, compassion, and unexpected redemption. Mama Rosie's boat glided smoothly to the muddy bank, where Arthur remained motionless in his wheelchair, his glazed eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and disbelief. The 73-year-old woman jumped from the boat with surprising agility for her age, her bare feet sinking into the mud without hesitation. "Easy. Now, mister, we're here to help," she said with a firm but kind voice, approaching the abandoned old man. Her brown eyes, marked by the wrinkles of one who had spent decades smiling under the Louisiana sun, radiated a genuine kindness that Arthur hadn't seen in a long time. Rosie quickly assessed the condition of the man before her. His expensive Clothes, though soaked and muddy, bespoke an urban origin and privileged financial status. But at that moment, those social differences didn't matter. Before her was simply a human being in extreme need. "Clay, Bo, come help me here," she called to her two sons who had remained in the boat. "Let's take this gentleman home." Clay, 51 years old, had the thick, calloused hands of someone who had worked with fishing nets since childhood. His sun-weathered face bore the same kind expression as his mother, though marked by a life of hard work. Bo, 2 years younger, had the same robust physique as his brother, but his eyes revealed a natural curiosity that always made him question the situations around him. "Mama, how are we going to get the chair in the boat?" Bo asked, eyeing the dimensions of the fishing vessel. "We don't need the chair right now, son. The important thing is to save this soul," Rosie replied with the wisdom of one who had faced countless emergencies throughout her life in the bayou. With careful and experienced movements, the three family members managed to transfer Arthur from the wheelchair to the boat, wrapping him in a rough but warm woolen blanket that Rosie always kept in the boat for emergencies. The old man tried to speak, but his voice came out only as a hoarse whisper between shivers caused by the cold and exhaustion. "Don't you worry about talking now, mister. First, we'll take care of your body. Then we can talk," said the matriarch, positioning herself beside Arthur, while Clay steered the boat through the narrow channels that cut through the bayou. The family's houseboat gradually appeared through the morning mist, a rustic but solid structure that moved gently with the natural undulations of the water. Made mainly of local hardwood harvested from the region decades ago, the house had a simple charm that contrasted dramatically with the urban luxury Arthur had become accustomed to during his life as a successful businessman. "Careful with the steps, they're slippery from the rain," Bo warned as they helped Arthur into the house. The interior of the houseboat proved surprisingly welcoming. The wooden walls were decorated with old family photographs, handmade fishing tools, and simple religious objects that denoted a deep and sincere faith. The smell of burning wood and fresh coffee created an atmosphere of a true home that Arthur hadn't experienced in years. Rosie directed her sons to settle the old man in the only bedroom in the house, a small chamber with a single bed covered with colorful handmade quilts. Small but strategically placed windows allowed natural light, filtered by the bayou's morning mist, to enter. "I'll make some warm tea and something for him to eat," announced the matriarch, heading to the rustic kitchen where a wood-burning stove was already lit for the family's breakfast. While Rosie prepared the herbal tea with herbs she cultivated herself in small pots around the house, her two sons remained beside Arthur, observing him with a mixture of curiosity and genuine concern. "How could someone abandon an old man like this?" Clay murmured to his brother, keeping his voice low so as not to disturb the man who was finally beginning to stop shivering. "There must be a story behind it," Bo replied, noticing details that had gone unnoticed in the rush of the rescue. "Look at his clothes, his watch. This man isn't poor. Someone with money abandoned him there." Arthur, even in his weakened state, managed to catch fragments of the conversation between the brothers. For the first time in hours, he tried to form coherent words, his voice still weak but more audible than before. "Thank you. You saved my life." Clay approached the bed, pulling up a simple wooden chair to sit beside the old man. "No need to thank us, mister. Anyone would have done the same." "No, not anyone," Arthur replied, his eyes filling with tears that had nothing to do with his physical condition. My own son abandoned me there." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of water gently lapping against the stilts of the houseboat. The two brothers exchanged meaningful glances, both struggling to process the cruelty implicit in that revelation. Rosie returned to the room carrying a wooden tray with a steaming cup of herbal tea and a few slices of still warm homemade bread. Her maternal instinct, sharpened by decades of caring not only for her own children, but for the entire Riverside community, immediately detected the emotional tension hanging in the air. "What happened here?" she asked with the natural authority of a matriarch, placing the tray on an improvised table beside the bed. "Mama, he said it was his own son who abandoned him there," Bo explained, his voice tinged with restrained indignation. Rosie automatically crossed herself, a gesture that had become instinctive over a life dedicated to her Christian faith. "Jesus protect us," she murmured, approaching the bed to help Arthur sit up and drink the tea. "What's your name, mister?" she asked gently, holding the cup so he could take small sips of the hot, aromatic liquid. "Arthur. Arthur Cole," he replied, feeling the warmth of the tea begin to circulate through his weakened body. Rosie frowned as if the name sounded familiar. "Cole, that name rings a bell." She remained silent for a few seconds, searching her memory for some connection. "You wouldn't be related to the Coles who owned land around here?" "A long time. Jago." Arthur nodded slowly. "My father had a small farm here back in the 50s. I was born here, but I left when I was young to study in the city." The revelation had a visible impact on the matriarch. She sat down heavily in the chair Clay had vacated, her eyes fixed on the old man's face, as if she were seeing a ghost from the past. "My lord," she whispered, "you're Mr. Cole's son, the one who had that farm near Cypress Creek?" "Yes, that was my father," Arthur confirmed, intrigued by the woman's emotional reaction. Rosie stood up abruptly and went to an old wooden chest in a corner of the room. With trembling hands, she removed a few objects until she found what she was looking for, an old shoebox yellowed with age, full of photographs and letters. "Clay, Beau, you won't believe what I'm about to show you," she said, returning to the bed with the box in her hands. She carefully opened the box and removed a black and white photograph, slightly faded, but still clear enough to reveal its secrets. The image showed a group of young people smiling at the camera in front of a simple farmhouse. Among them, a young woman of about 18 with long dark hair and a radiant smile stood next to a young man of the same age, his arm affectionately around her shoulders. "This is me, over 50 years ago," Rosie said, pointing to the young woman in the photograph. "And this one here beside me," Arthur took the photograph with trembling hands, bringing it closer to his eyes to see better. When he recognized the young man in the image, his face lit up with a mixture of joy and nostalgia that seemed to rejuvenate him instantly. "Rosie. Rosie Dubois. I remember you," he said, his voice gaining strength for the first time since the abandonment. We used to meet near the old pond on Sundays. After church," she completed, smiling through the tears that began to stream down her wrinkled face. "You always brought me wildflowers." Her two sons watched the scene in respectful silence, understanding that they were witnessing the reunion of two souls who had been separated by life's circumstances decades ago. "What happened to us, Arthur?" Rosie asked, sitting on the edge of the bed and gently holding the old man's free hand. "Why did you leave without saying goodbye?" Arthur closed his eyes, allowing long-buried memories to return to the surface. "My father lost the farm in a bad bet. We had to leave overnight, no time for explanations." His voice trembled with the emotion of the memories. "I wrote letters to you, but I could never send them. I didn't even have money for postage." Rosie nodded sympathetically. "I waited for you for months. I went to the pond every Sunday, thinking maybe you'd come back." She smiled sadly. "I ended up marrying Joseph 2 years later. He was a good man, gave me these 2 wonderful sons." "And were you happy?" Arthur asked, genuinely interested in the answer. "I was, yes. Different from what it might have been with you, but I was happy in my own way." Rosie squeezed his hand tighter. "And you, did you build a family?" Arthur's expression darkened again. "I married a good woman who passed away 10 years ago. We had one son who turned out to be very different from the man I hoped he would become." Rosie immediately understood that they had returned to the painful subject of his abandonment. "Tell me what happened, Arthur. Sometimes talking about the pain helps to heal it." And so on that misty morning in the Louisiana bayou, as the sun struggled to break through the heavy clouds that still threatened more rain, Arthur began to narrate the story of his life, his business successes, the sacrifices made to build an empire, and the growing coldness of a son who saw only numbers where he should have seen human relationships. As he spoke, Rosie and her sons listened in respectful silence, occasionally asking gentle questions that encouraged him to continue. Gradually, Arthur realized he was experiencing something he hadn't felt in years, the sensation of being truly heard and understood. When he finished his narrative, the sun had finally managed to break through the clouds, filling the small room with a golden light that seemed to bless that unlikely encounter between souls who had recognized each other across time and circumstances. "You'll stay here with us as long as you need," Rosie declared with the authority of a decision already made. "This house may be simple, but it has room for everyone who needs shelter." Arthur felt something break inside his chest, not something physical related to his illness, but an emotional barrier he had built around his wounded heart. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to cry openly, not from pain or despair, but from a deep gratitude he didn't even know he was still capable of feeling. 3 weeks had passed since Arthur's rescue, and the routine of the houseboat had naturally adapted to the presence of the new resident. The old man, who had arrived as a shattered soul abandoned to his fate, was now beginning to show surprising signs of improvement, both physically and emotionally. Every morning, Rosie prepared a special herbal tea that she personally collected from the wetlands surrounding the house. The blend of local healing herbs, combined with wildflower honey that Clay got from beekeepers in the area, had proven more effective than many of the expensive medicines Arthur had been taking before he was abandoned. "City doctors may know a lot about medicine," Rosie had commented one morning, watching Arthur manage to walk a few steps unaided. "But the bayou's nature teaches things that aren't written in books." That April afternoon, as the sun cast golden reflections on the calm waters surrounding the property, Arthur was sitting on the houseboat's porch, helping Bo mend a fishing net. His hands, once trembling and frail, could now make more precise movements, weaving the threads with a skill he didn't even know he possessed. "Why, you're getting good at this, mister," Bo praised, observing the old man's careful work. "Looks like you've done this before." Arthur smiled, an expression that had become more frequent during his stay with the fishing family. "My father taught me when I was a boy. I never thought I'd remember after so many years." It was at that moment that Clay arrived from the nearby town, paddling his small pirogue with more haste than usual. His worried expression immediately caught everyone's attention on the porch. "Mama, I need to talk to y'all," he said, tying up the boat and quickly climbing the steps of the house. "I have important news." Rosie came out of the kitchen, drying her hands on a hand-embroidered dish towel. "What is it, son? You look like you've seen a ghost." Clay glanced significantly at Arthur before continuing. "In town, I ran into Mr. Peterson, the one who's worked at the county records office for 40 years. He told me something I thought you should know." The name Peterson made Arthur lift his head from the fishing net. Michael Peterson had been a childhood friend of his father and had worked at the records office since he was young. If anyone in the region knew the historical details of local properties, it was him. "Spit it out, son. Don't keep me in suspense," Rosie urged, sitting down in a wooden chair beside Arthur. "Mr. Peterson told me that Mr. Arthur's company here was responsible for a large real estate project in the region, about 25 years ago." Clay paused, observing the reactions around him. "The project that displaced many riverside families from their lands, including ours." The silence that followed was as thick as the bayou morning mist. Arthur felt the weight of a revelation that had remained buried in his memory for decades. Rosie remained motionless, processing the information that unexpectedly connected the distant past with the present. "I remember that project," Arthur admitted slowly, his voice laden with complex emotion. "It was a tourism development. I was young, ambitious. I only saw the numbers, the potential profits." Bo stopped working on the fishing net, his attention completely focused on the conversation. "Mama, what exactly happened back then?" Rosie sighed deeply before answering. "We had a wooden house on a small island about 10 miles from here. We lived off fishing and a vegetable garden I kept. It was a simple life, but it was ours." Her hands clenched slightly. "One day, men in suits showed up saying the area had been sold for a resort project. We had 30 days to leave." Arthur closed his eyes, the memories returning with painful clarity. "I was responsible for land acquisitions for that project. My job was to identify undervalued properties and negotiate the purchases." His voice trembled. "I didn't think about the families that would be affected. I only saw business opportunities." "And what happened to the project?" Clay asked. though part of him already suspected the answer. It was a complete failure, Arthur admitted bitterly. The foreign investors pulled out midway through construction. The land was abandoned, full of unfinished structures that nature gradually reclaimed. He looked directly at Rosie. Dozens of families lost their homes for nothing. Rosie remained silent for long moments, her gaze lost on the bayou waters. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but carried a deep wisdom. Joseph, my late husband, became very bitter about that situation. He used to say that city folk didn't understand what it meant to have your roots torn out. She turned to face Arthur. But I always believed that people can change, that God put situations in our path to teach us important lessons. Arthur's confession could have created a chasm between him and the family that had saved him. Instead, it seemed to deepen their mutual understanding in a way none of them had anticipated. I can compensate you, Arthur said impulsively. I have resources, influence. I can get you a better property, a house in the city. We don't want your material compensation. Arthur, Rosie interrupted gently, what we want is for you to understand that your presence here is no coincidence. God has plans that we don't comprehend at the moment they happen. It was at that moment that a new boat appeared on the horizon, a modern speedboat approaching, the houseboat rapidly. Clay stood up, shading his eyes with his hand to identify the occupants. Who could that be? Beau murmured, joining his brother at the edge of the porch. The speedboat slowed as it approached, revealing two men dressed in city clothes but appropriate for the bayou environment. The younger one, about 28 years old, had features that immediately caught Arthur's attention. There was something familiar about that face that made him stand up abruptly from his chair. "Grandpa!" shouted the young man, even before the boat had finished docking. "Grandpa, is that really you?" Arthur felt his legs go weak, not from illness, but from the overwhelming emotion of recognizing the voice of his grandson Liam, Ethan's son, who had secretly kept in touch with his grandfather against his father's wishes. Liam jumped from the speedboat as soon as it touched the houseboat's makeshift pier, running towards his grandfather, with tears streaming down his face. The young man, a business graduate but with a sensitive heart inherited from his mother, had spent the last 3 weeks desperately searching for his missing grandfather. "How did you find me?" Arthur asked, hugging his grandson with a strength that surprised them both. "I hired a private investigator," Liam explained, breathing heavily from the run. "We tracked Dad's truck GPS the night you disappeared. We found the abandoned wheelchair, and then we asked local fishermen until someone mentioned that a family had rescued an elderly man." The second man in the speedboat approached more cautiously. He was the private investigator, an experienced, middle-aged professional who had worked on similar cases throughout his career. "Mr. Cole," he said respectfully, "I need to inform you that your son Ethan filed a false police report, claiming you had left home alone during the night due to mental confusion related to your illness." The revelation of Ethan's attempt to cover up his crime with official lies caused visible indignation among everyone present. Rosie crossed herself again, murmuring a prayer for the lost soul of the ungrateful son. "There's more," the investigator continued. "We discovered that Ethan falsified medical documents to obtain a declaration of your mental incapacity, with the aim of taking full control of your assets." Liam clenched his fists, fighting against an anger he rarely felt. "Grandpa, I have important news about the company too. I found out Dad was embezzling money from the charitable foundations you maintained, using the resources for risky real estate speculation." Arthur sat down heavily in his chair, not from physical weakness, but from the weight of the revelations about the extent of his son's moral corruption. Rosie immediately positioned herself beside him, offering the silent support that had become natural between them. "There's something else you all need to know," Liam said, looking significantly at the fishing family. "Grandpa, do you remember that resort project that failed 25 years ago?" Arthur nodded, still processing the conflicting emotions that memory brought. "The lands were never sold. They are still registered in our company's name, abandoned and unused for decades." Liam smiled for the first time since his arrival. "Legally, they belong to you, Grandpa, and I have a proposal." Liam's proposal was revolutionary in its simplicity and justice. He had spent months developing a plan to transform the abandoned lands of the failed project into an ecological reserve, managed by the riverside families who had originally been displaced. It would be a form of compensation and preservation. At the same time, he explained enthusiastically, the families could return to their lands, develop sustainable ecotourism, and the company would take responsibility for financing the necessary infrastructure. Rosie and her sons exchanged meaningful glances. Every step Ethan took on the same path, where he had pushed his father weeks ago, was a physical reminder of the gravity of his actions. When they finally reached the houseboat, Mama Rosie received them with the natural courtesy of an experienced hostess, but Ethan could perceive the careful coolness in her eyes. She knew exactly who he was and what he had done. "Arthur is on the porch," she said simply, indicating the direction with a gesture. Ethan found his father sitting in a simple wooden chair, watching the sunset over the calm waters of the bayou. Arthur looked different, not only healthier physically, but there was a peace in his posture that Ethan didn't remember seeing in a long time. "Dad?" Ethan said hesitantly, his voice almost a whisper. Arthur turned slowly, and when his eyes met his son's, Ethan saw something he didn't expect. Not anger or condemnation, but a deep, loving sadness. "Ethan," Arthur said simply, extending a trembling hand towards his son. "You came." Ethan approached hesitantly, taking his father's hand and kneeling beside the chair. "Dad, I don't know how to begin to ask for forgiveness." "Then don't start by asking for forgiveness," Arthur said gently. "Start by telling me why you did what you did. I need to understand." And so, on the porch of a houseboat in the middle of the Louisiana bayou, Ethan began to reveal the pressures, fears, and distorted ambitions that had gradually eroded his humanity over the years. He spoke about the constant pressure to maintain the business empire, about the fear of being seen as weak, about how he had confused financial success with personal worth. Arthur listened in silence, occasionally squeezing his son's hand to encourage him to continue. When Ethan finished his confession, both were crying, not tears of despair, but of a mutual recognition of shared humanity that had been temporarily lost. "Dad, is there any way to repair what I've done?" Ethan asked. Arthur smiled through his tears. "My son, the repair already began the moment you decided to come here looking for me." 6 months had passed since the emotional confrontation between Ethan and Arthur on the houseboat porch. What began as a desperate plea for forgiveness had transformed into an extraordinary journey of personal and community transformation that surprised even the most optimistic observers. Ethan had made a radical decision. He temporarily left the management of the New York City company in the hands of trusted administrators and moved into a simple house near the ecological restoration project that was taking shape on the former lands of the abandoned resort. The man's physical transformation was almost unrecognizable. The always impeccably dressed executive had given way to someone who wore practical clothes suitable for field work, his once manicured hands now calloused. From manual labor, his skin tanned by the Louisiana sun. But the most notable change was in his eyes. Where there once was a calculating coldness, now shone a determination fueled by genuine purpose. That October morning, Ethan was overseeing the construction of an ecological research station when he heard the familiar sound of a boat approaching. It was Mama Rosie, accompanied by her son Clay and 3 other bayou families who had decided to return to their ancestral lands as part of the restoration project. "Good morning, Ethan," Mama Rosie greeted, using the respectful but warm tone that had gradually replaced her initial distrust. "How's the work coming along?" "Good morning, Mama Rosie. We're on schedule," Ethan replied, wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. "The research station should be ready next week, and the first eco-homes will be habitable in a month." The project had grown far beyond initial expectations. What began as simple compensation for the displaced families had evolved into a pioneering model of sustainable development that was attracting national and international attention. The ecological reserve now encompassed 15,000 acres of restored land, including permanent preservation areas, nature trails, a scientific research station, and a cluster of sustainable houses built with local materials and traditional techniques enhanced with modern technology. "Your father is waiting for you at the main house," Clay informed him. "He said he received important news from New York." Ethan nodded, saying goodbye to the construction crew before accompanying the family to the houseboat where Arthur had decided to take up permanent residence. The original dwelling had been expanded and modernized to accommodate the old man's medical needs, but retained its characteristic rustic charm. He found his father in the main room, talking animatedly with Liam, who had become a regular visitor and the primary urban coordinator for the project. Official documents and photographs were spread across the waxed wooden table as evidence of important developments. "Ethan, sit down," Arthur said, his voice noticeably stronger and clearer than months before. "We have excellent news to share." Liam stood up to hug his father, a gesture that had become natural between them during the recent months of working together. "Dad, you won't believe what we've achieved." Ethan sat in a rustic chair, observing the evident excitement on both their faces. "I'm curious. First," Arthur said, picking up an official document, "we received formal approval from the federal government to transform our reserve into a national wildlife refuge and sustainable development area. We are the first private project in the United States to receive this classification." The news was extraordinary. The classification as a national refuge signified official recognition of the project's ecological and social importance, as well as access to federal resources for research and development. "Second," Liam continued, 3 international universities want to establish permanent research programs here. This means ongoing funding and qualified employment opportunities for young people from the region." Ethan felt a complex emotion, genuine pride mixed with humility at the magnitude of what they had managed to build together. How was this possible so quickly? "The answer is in this," Arthur said, handing his son a folder containing newspaper and magazine clippings. "Our project is being used as an international model for how companies can repair past environmental and social damage." Ethan flipped through the articles, finding headlines in English, Spanish, and French. "American company pioneers ecological restoration, from abandonment to redemption. The Bayou story. Sustainability model attracts global investors." "There's one more thing," Liam said with a mysterious smile. "Do you remember when we discussed expanding the model to other regions?" Ethan nodded. During evenings on the porch, they had dreamed of replicating the project in other degraded areas of the US, but always considered it a long-term goal. "I've received calls from business people from Appalachia, the Pacific Northwest, and even from other countries in North and South America. They all want to implement similar projects using our methodology." Liam opened a laptop showing a detailed presentation. "We have the potential to create an international network of sustainable development reserves." The prospect was simultaneously exciting and daunting. Ethan had spent months learning to balance ambition with responsibility, and the idea of rapid growth activated both his business skills and his new ethical scruples. "This is wonderful," he said carefully, "but we need to ensure that expansion doesn't compromise the quality and principles we've established here." Arthur smiled, recognizing the wisdom his son had developed. "Exactly what I hoped you'd say." It was at that moment that Mama Rosie entered the room, carrying a tray with herbal tea and homemade cookies. Her presence had become a stabilizing element in family discussions, offering a practical perspective grounded in community experience. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I thought you should know that a national television crew arrived this morning. They want to do a story on our community." The news brought a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. Ethan had learned to value the privacy and authenticity of life in the bayou, and the prospect of media exposure raised concerns about over-commercialization. "What do you think?" he asked, addressing both his father and Mama Rosie. "Should we agree to the story?" "I think," Mama Rosie said thoughtfully, "that our story can inspire other people to make positive changes in their own lives. But we need to control how our story is told." Arthur agreed. "The report could be valuable if we focus on the lessons learned and the importance of second chances, rather than simply dramatizing the sensational aspects." And so it was decided. The story would be filmed, but under strict conditions. Focus on community transformation, respect for the privacy of the families involved, and emphasis on the possibilities of replicating the model in other regions. 2 weeks later, when the story aired on the nation's highest-rated Sunday program, the phone at the houseboat didn't stop ringing. Calls from interested business people, from families in similar situations seeking hope, from politicians offering support, and from international organizations proposing partnerships. But the most significant call came on a rainy Thursday, when Clay answered the phone and heard a nervous female voice on the other end. "Please, I need to speak with Mr. Ethan." "Cole," the woman said. "This is Charlotte, his ex-wife. I saw the report on television and I need to talk to him about our daughter." Ethan had divorced Charlotte 5 years earlier, when his obsession with work and his growing emotional coldness had made the marriage unsustainable. Their daughter, Maya, 19 years old, had chosen to live with her mother and had maintained minimal contact with her father since then. When Ethan answered the phone, his voice trembled slightly. "Charlotte, how did you get this number?" "Ethan, I need to tell you something about Maya," she said, her voice laden with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. She saw the report about you and your father. She cried, Ethan. For the first time in years, she cried talking about you." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. "What did she say?" "She said she finally saw the father she remembered from when she was little. The man who used to take her fishing, who made up bedtime stories, who made her laugh." Charlotte paused. "Ethan, she wants to see you. She wants to meet her grandfather and understand what happened to our family." The conversation that followed was one of the most emotional of Ethan's life. Charlotte explained how Maya had become an introspective and distrustful teenager, building emotional walls to protect herself from disillusionment with the father who had become a cold and distant stranger. "She enrolled in a biology course because of the report," Charlotte continued. "She wants to study environmental conservation, said she wants to be part of something bigger than herself, like you're doing now." Ethan closed his eyes, seeing, in his mind, the image of his daughter at 10 years old, when she used to accompany him on fishing trips and dreamed of being a nature scientist. He had completely forgotten that passion of hers, lost in his own destructive ambitions. "Charlotte, I'd very much like to see her, but I'm afraid it's too late, that I've caused irreparable damage." "Ethan," Charlotte said softly, "if you manage to reconcile with your father after everything that happened, maybe there's still hope for our family too." The call ended with Ethan inviting Charlotte and Maya to visit the project in the bayou during Maya's school break. When he hung up the phone, he found Arthur watching him with an understanding smile. "Second chances come in waves, my son," the old man said. "One second chance leads to another, and then to another. Dad, what if I can't be the father Maya needs? What if it's too late to rebuild our relationship?" Arthur rose from his chair. With the agility he had regained during months of healthy living in the bayou, walking to the window that overlooked the tranquil waters where he had arrived a broken man and found a new reason to live. "Ethan, you are no longer the same man you were 6 months ago, and Maya is not the same girl who drifted away from you." He turned to face his son. "You two will have to get to know each other again, as different people than you were before." Liam, who had listened to the conversation in respectful silence, finally spoke up. "Dad, if you want, I can talk to Maya before she comes. Explain everything you've been through, how you've changed." "No, son," Ethan replied. "This is a conversation I need to have with her personally. I want her to see me as I am now, not through second-hand explanations." Mama Rosie, who had remained in the kitchen during the call, appeared in the living room with a cup of hot tea for Ethan. "A 19-year-old girl can be stubborn as a mule, but she also has a heart as soft as melted butter," she said with practical wisdom. "If you're sincere with her, she'll feel it." The next few weeks were filled with anxious preparations for Maya's visit. Ethan wanted her to see not only the environmental project, but also to understand the personal journey that had led him there. He organized presentations about the ongoing scientific research, planned hikes along the nature trails, and even learned to cook a few local dishes with Mama Rosie's help. "You're more nervous than a groom on his wedding day," Clay joked, watching Ethan check the preparations for Maya's arrival for the 10th time. "It's just that I only have one chance to get this right," Ethan replied, adjusting the pillows. On the bed in the guest room, he had specially prepared for his daughter. When the day of the visit finally arrived, Ethan was at the edge of the swamp at 5 in the morning, anxiously watching every movement on the dirt road that led to the embarkation point for the houseboat. Arthur and Mama Rosie had insisted on accompanying him, recognizing that this moment would be crucial not only for Ethan, but for the entire family dynamic they had helped rebuild. At 10 in the morning, a rental van appeared on the dusty road. Ethan felt his heart race when he recognized the figures of Charlotte and Maya getting out of the vehicle. His ex-wife looked the same, still attractive at 45, with her brown hair tied in a practical ponytail. But Maya had transformed into a young woman. At 19, she had inherited her mother's natural beauty, but there was something in her eyes, an intensity, a precocious maturity that reminded Ethan of himself in his youth. She wore practical clothes suitable for the bayou environment and carried a backpack that clearly contained research equipment. "Dad," she said hesitantly, as they approached the bank where Ethan awaited them. "Maya," he replied, his voice choked with emotion, You've grown so much." The first meeting was inevitably awkward. 5 years of distance couldn't be overcome with a simple hug. But when Ethan introduced Maya to her grandfather, something magical happened. "So you're my scientist granddaughter," Arthur said with a warm smile, extending his hands to greet her. "Your father told me you want to study environmental conservation." Maya blushed slightly, but her eyes shone with interest. "Grandpa, is it true that you transformed devastated lands into a functional ecological reserve in less than a year?" "It's true, my dear, and we'd love to show you how we did it." The walk through the ecological reserve was revealing for Maya. Ethan watched with growing pride as his daughter asked sophisticated technical questions about habitat restoration, scientific research methods, and economic sustainability. It was evident that she had prepared extensively for the visit, studying not only the project, but also the scientific principles behind it. "Dad," she said during lunch at the houseboat, "how did you manage to change so much? I mean, 2 years ago you didn't even remember my birthday, and now you're leading a project that could change the way people think about conservation." Ethan put his fork down, knowing this was the moment of truth. "Maya, I need to tell you about the worst mistake I've ever made in my life, and about how that mistake taught me who I really want to be." Over the next 2 hours, Ethan told his daughter the whole story: the cruel abandonment of her grandfather, Liam's discovery, the emotional confrontation, and the journey of transformation that followed. He omitted no details, softened no guilt, sought no justifications for his past actions. Maya listened in silence, her expressions varying between shock, sadness, and eventually a complex understanding that was simultaneously mature and moving. "Dad," she said finally, "that explains a lot about why you pulled away from me and Mom. You were losing yourself, weren't you?" "Yes, my daughter. And in the process, I lost the most important things in my life, you both." Maya remained silent for long moments, observing the tranquil waters of the bayou through the houseboat window. When she finally turned to face her father, her eyes shone with unshed tears. "Dad, I want to be a part of this. I want to learn about what you're doing here. I want to help with the project. But more than that..." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I want to get to know who you are now." Ethan felt as if a gigantic weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Maya, nothing would make me happier." The rest of the visit was a revelation for the whole family. Maya demonstrated not only intellectual interest in the project, but also a natural aptitude for fieldwork and an innate ability to connect with the bayou families. Mama Rosie was particularly impressed with the young woman's willingness to learn traditional conservation techniques and her skill in asking respectful questions about local culture. "She has the heart of a researcher and the soul of a good person," Mama Rosie commented to Ethan one morning, watching Maya help Clay catalog plant species on the nature trail. On the last day of the visit, Maya made an announcement that surprised everyone. "Dad, Grandpa, I've decided what I want to do when I finish college," she said during the farewell dinner. "I want to pursue a PhD in ecological restoration, and I want to spend my summers working here on the project." Ethan felt an overwhelming emotion. pride, gratitude, and a renewed hope for his family's future. "Maya, are you sure? It's a big commitment, and the work here can be challenging." "I'm sure, Dad. For the first time in my life, I've found something that makes me want to wake up in the morning." She looked around the table, where her reconstituted family shared a simple but profoundly significant meal. "And I've found a family that wants me around." Arthur raised his teacup in an improvised toast. To second chances, to families that rebuild themselves, and to dreams that come true. Everyone raised their cups. And at that moment, in the houseboat in the middle of the Louisiana bayou, a family that had been destroyed by greed and pride found its way back to wholeness, not as they were before, but as something new and better. When Maya and Charlotte left the next day, they left behind not only promises of return, but also a completely transformed family dynamic. Ethan knew there was still much work to be done. Relationships take time to rebuild, and trust is something earned gradually. But for the first time in many years, he had something he had completely lost: hope for his family's future and faith in his own ability to be a positive force in the world. The ecological restoration project would continue to grow and inspire others around the world. But for Ethan, Arthur, and now Maya, it had become something more profound than a simple environmental initiative. It had become the tangible symbol that it's never too late for transformative changes, as long as someone has enough courage to take the first step towards redemption. 2 years had passed since Maya's transformative visit to the bayou. What began as a story of family abandonment and redemption had evolved into a global movement that was redefining how the world thought about corporate responsibility, environmental restoration, and second chances. Ethan was in his new permanent home in the bayou, a sustainable construction made with local materials that combined modern comfort with environmental harmony, when he received a call that would once again change the course of his life. "Mr. Cole, this is Dr. James Albright from the Nobel Foundation," said the voice on the other end with a refined British accent. "I am calling to inform you that the Bayou Ecological Restoration Project has been nominated for this year's Nobel Peace Prize." Ethan almost dropped the phone. "Excuse me, Doctor, I don't think I understood correctly." "You understood perfectly, Mr. Cole. Your initiative has been recognized not only for its extraordinary environmental results, but for the innovative model of how historical conflicts between economic development and environmental preservation can be resolved through community collaboration and corporate responsibility." The call lasted another 40 minutes, during which Dr. Albright explained that the project had been nominated by a coalition of international organizations that recognized its global impact. In just 2 years, the model developed in the bayou had been replicated in 23 countries, creating a worldwide network of sustainable development reserves that was transforming millions of acres of degraded land into thriving ecosystems. When Ethan finally hung up the phone, he found Arthur on the porch watching Maya and a group of international university students conducting research in the nearby lagoon. His grandfather, now 83, had become a revered figure in the international scientific community, frequently consulted as a living example of how traditional wisdom and modern science could work together. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice still trembling, with emotion, "we've just been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize." Arthur turned slowly, a serene smile illuminating his sun-tanned face. "And how do you feel about that, my son?" Ethan sat in the chair beside his father, watching Maya instruct the students on water sampling techniques. His daughter, now 21, had become a natural leader in the project, combining rigorous scientific knowledge with an intuitive ability to connect people from different cultures around common goals. "I feel gratitude, Dad, and also responsibility. This recognition isn't about me, it's about all of us, about the entire community we've built here." "Exactly," Arthur agreed, "and about all the communities you've inspired around the world." Indeed, the project's global impact had surpassed all expectations. The methodology developed in the bayou, combining ecological restoration, community empowerment, scientific research, and economic sustainability, was being applied. In places as diverse as devastated forests in Indonesia, arid lands in North Africa, and degraded urban areas in Europe. The model had evolved to include a sophisticated system of knowledge exchange between projects, allowing innovations developed in one reserve to be quickly adapted and implemented in others. A digital platform connected more than 50,000 active participants worldwide, from renowned scientists to young students like Maya. "Ethan!" Liam shouted from the edge of the lagoon, waving vigorously. "You need to see this!" Ethan and Arthur walked over to where Liam was talking animatedly with a middle-aged man Ethan didn't immediately recognize. The stranger had a distinguished appearance, tan skin, graying hair, and a presence that exuded natural authority. "Dad, this is Secretary Evans from the U.S. Department of the Interior," Liam introduced. "He came personally to invite us to implement our model in the Pacific Northwest old-growth forests." Secretary Evans approached Ethan with a warm smile. "Mr. Cole, it's an honor to meet you personally. Your work here has become legendary in environmental circles. We have a proposal that might interest you." Over the next 2 hours, Secretary Evans presented an ambitious plan. The federal government wanted to create the largest sustainable development reserve in the country, encompassing 500,000 acres of degraded old-growth forest. The project would be funded by a public-private partnership and would use the Bayou methodology as its foundation. "It would be the biggest test of our model so far," Secretary Evans explained, "but it also represents a unique opportunity to demonstrate that sustainable development can work on a massive scale within the nation." Ethan listened to the proposal with growing interest, but also with a caution he had learned during his years of transformation. "Mr. Secretary, this type of project requires not only financial resources, but also long-term commitment and genuine respect for local communities, including tribal nations." "That's exactly why we're here," the Secretary replied. "We want to learn not only your techniques, but also your philosophy. How did you manage to balance economic development with environmental preservation and social justice?" The question triggered a fascinating discussion that lasted until sunset. Ethan, Arthur, Liam, Maya, Mama Rosie, and even Clay contributed their perspectives on the essential elements that had made the project successful. "The key," Mama Rosie said with her practical wisdom, "is to never forget that we're dealing with people, not just numbers and statistics. Every family, every community has its own history and needs." Maya, who had become surprisingly articulate for her age, added, "And it's essential to involve local youth from the beginning. We are the ones who will inherit these lands, so we need to be part of the solution." When Secretary Evans departed the next day, he took with him not only a commitment for technical consultation, but also a deep understanding of the humanistic principles that made the Bayou model truly sustainable. A week later, Ethan received another surprising call. It was from New York, from the United Nations headquarters. "Mr. Cole, this is Dr. Evelyn Hayes, Director of the United Nations Environment Program," said the professional voice. "We would like to invite you to be the keynote speaker at the Global Climate Change Summit in December." Ethan felt a familiar mix of honor and responsibility. "Dr. Hayes, I am honored by the invitation, but I must say I'm not an experienced speaker at events of this magnitude. Mr. Cole, what the world needs to hear are not polished speeches, but true stories of transformation. Your personal journey and the practical results of your project represent exactly the kind of leadership we need to face global environmental challenges." The prospect of speaking to world leaders was intimidating, but Ethan recognized that this would be a unique opportunity to amplify the message of hope the project represented. "I accept the invitation, Dr. Hayes, but I would like to bring some members of our community with me. This is not my individual story, it's our collective story." "Perfect. That will make your presentation even more powerful." In the following months, Ethan, Arthur, Maya, Mama Rosie, and Clay prepared for what would be the biggest stage of their lives. The preparation included not only creating a comprehensive technical presentation, but also deep reflections on the most important lessons they had learned during their journey. "What do you think is the most important message we should share?" Ethan asked during one of the preparation sessions at the houseboat. "That it's never too late for change," Arthur replied immediately. "That people can transform, communities can be healed, and damage can be repaired. That real solutions come from the bottom up, not the top down." Mama Rosie added. Governments and companies can provide resources, but local communities must lead the implementation. Maya, who had become the voice of the new generation in the project, offered a different perspective. That young people can be part of the solution if we give them real opportunities for leadership, not just symbolic roles. Liam, connecting via video conference from New York City, where he now coordinated the project's national expansion, added that sustainable businesses are not only possible, but more profitable in the long run than traditional destructive models. In December, the group traveled to New York. For Ethan, who had traveled the world on business trips during his previous life, the experience was surreally different. Instead of luxury hotels and expensive restaurants, they stayed in a modest hotel and spent time exploring community environmental initiatives in the city's less privileged neighborhoods. The night before the presentation, Ethan couldn't sleep. He went out onto his hotel room balcony, observing the endless lights of the city that never sleeps, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had taken him from that luxurious office in New York to this moment. Arthur appeared on the balcony, wearing the simple robe that had become his characteristic attire. "Nervous, my son?" "Terrified," Ethan admitted. "Tomorrow I'll be speaking to presidents, prime ministers, CEOs of the world's largest companies. What can a former executive, who almost killed his own father, teach these people?" Arthur approached, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Ethan, you'll be speaking to people who are likely facing the same temptations and pressures you faced. Your story isn't about judgment, it's about hope." The next day, when Ethan stepped up to the podium in the main auditorium of the United Nations, he saw a sea of expectant faces, some curious, others skeptical, many visibly tired of empty promises about sustainability. He began not with statistics or graphs, but with a confession. "My name is Ethan Cole, and 3 years ago I committed the worst crime a son can commit against his father. I abandoned him in a wheelchair in the middle of a swamp, expecting him to die." The silence in the auditorium was complete. In the history of the United Nations, no presentation had ever begun with such a brutal admission of personal guilt. For the next 45 minutes, Ethan told the whole story. His personal transformation, the development of the project, the community's involvement, and the results that had surpassed all expectations. But more importantly, he shared the lessons, learned about leadership, responsibility, and the transformative power of second chances. "Sustainability isn't just about technology or regulations," he concluded. "It's about recognizing our shared humanity and our responsibility to one another. It's about creating systems that allow people and communities to thrive together instead of competing for mutual destruction." The standing ovation that followed lasted more than 5 minutes, but for Ethan, the most significant moment came later, when a line of world leaders approached, not to congratulate him on his presentation, but to share their own stories of past mistakes and hopes for redemption. The president of a small African nation confessed that he had authorized mining projects that devastated local communities and wanted to implement a restoration program. The CEO of a European multinational admitted that his company had contributed to river pollution in several countries and was looking for ways to repair the damage. "Your story gave us permission to admit our own mistakes," said the Prime Minister of a Nordic country. "And more importantly, it showed us that mistakes can be transformed into opportunities to do something better." In the months following the United Nations conference, the Bayou project received more than 200 requests for implementation in different countries. Ethan, now recognized as a world leader in sustainable development, had to make careful decisions about which projects to support and how to maintain the integrity of the original model. "We have an enormous responsibility," he said during a meeting of the core team at the houseboat. "Every project we endorse carries our name and our reputation." Maya, who had been accepted to a prestigious American university but decided to postpone her studies to work on the project for another year, offered a mature perspective. "Dad, maybe our responsibility isn't to control every project, but to ensure that the fundamental principles are preserved." The suggestion led to the development of the Bayou Protocol, a set of ethical and practical guidelines that any project could adopt to legitimately use the methodology. The protocol included strict requirements for community participation, financial transparency, environmental sustainability, and equitable social benefits. In June of the following year, the news everyone expected, but which still surprised with the emotion it provoked, arrived. The Bayou Ecological Restoration Project had won the Nobel Peace Prize. The award ceremony in Oslo was an extraordinary event. Ethan insisted that the entire core team be recognized as co-recipients, an unprecedented decision that the Nobel Committee accepted as a reflection of the project's collaborative character. When Ethan stepped up to the podium to receive the award, accompanied by Arthur, Maya, Mama Rosie, Clay, and Liam, he looked out at the international audience and saw not only dignitaries and celebrities, but also representatives from dozens of communities around the world that had implemented variations of the Bayou model. In his acceptance speech, Ethan didn't talk about himself, but about the transformative power of communities when they are given resources, respect, and real opportunities for leadership. "This award does not belong to me," he said, his voice echoing in the grand auditorium. "It belongs to every family that chose to return to their ancestral lands. It belongs to every young person who decided to dedicate their life to conservation. It belongs to every person who believed change was possible when others said it was too late." He paused, looking directly at Arthur, who was sitting in the front row with tears of pride streaming down his face. "But mostly, this award belongs to all those who had the courage to offer second chances to people who didn't deserve them, but who were willing to change. Because in the end, it's not our successes that define us, but our ability to learn from our failures and use those lessons to create something better." After the ceremony, during the official reception, Ethan was approached by a young journalist who asked a question many had in mind, but few dared to ask directly. "Mr. Cole, some critics argue that your personal transformation, though admirable, doesn't erase the fact that you almost killed your own father. How do you respond to that?" Ethan didn't hesitate in his response. "They are absolutely correct. Nothing I do for the rest of my life will erase the gravity of what I did. My transformation isn't about seeking forgiveness or trying to balance a moral scale." He looked out the window of the reception hall, where he could see the Norwegian fjords illuminated by the early evening sun. "My transformation is about taking full responsibility for the consequences of my past actions and using that responsibility as fuel to create as much good as possible in the world. Not to redeem myself, some mistakes are too great for complete redemption, but to honor the second chance I received by transforming it into opportunities for others." The response was widely quoted in international media and became one of the most respected aspects of Ethan's story. His refusal to minimize his past mistakes or claim complete forgiveness even in the face of worldwide recognition. 5 years after receiving the Nobel Prize, Ethan was again on the porch of the houseboat, watching the sunset over the tranquil waters of the bayou. At 65, he had become a respected international figure, but his greatest joy still came from simple moments: conversations with his father during breakfast, letters from Maya about her university studies, reports from Liam about new projects being implemented around the world. Mama Rosie, now 78 but still vigorous, approached with 2 cups of herbal tea. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, sitting in the chair beside his. "About how life can change completely when someone has the courage to face the truth about themselves," Ethan replied. "And about how it can change even more when someone has the courage to act on that truth," she added wisely. At that moment, Arthur appeared on the porch, moving with the surprising agility of his 86 years. "Ethan, I just spoke with Maya on the phone. She's been accepted into the doctoral program at Oxford, but she wants to know if she can do her research here in the Bayou." Ethan smiled. "And what did you say?" "I said this has always been her home and always will be." As the 3 of them sat on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the Bayou night sky, Ethan reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to that moment. From a cold, greedy executive who had abandoned his own father to die, he had become a world leader in sustainability. But more important than any external recognition, he had recovered his humanity and rebuilt his family. The project that had begun as a desperate attempt to repair an unforgivable crime had evolved into a global movement that was transforming how the world thought about development, community, and responsibility. More than 100 sustainable development reserves were operating in 45 countries, directly employing over 50,000 people and indirectly benefiting more than 2 million. But for Ethan, the statistics were less important than the individual stories. Families who had reclaimed their ancestral lands, young people who had found purpose in conservation careers, business people who had discovered that ethical businesses were also the most profitable in the long run. "Dad," Ethan said, turning to Arthur, "do you regret anything?" Arthur considered the question carefully before answering. "I regret taking so long to teach you what truly matters in life, but I don't regret the path we took to get here. Even considering everything you went through, Ethan, my son, if my suffering was necessary for your transformation, and if your transformation was necessary to help all these people around the world, then I cannot regret the suffering. It was part of a greater purpose that none of us could have foreseen." Mama Rosie, listening to the conversation, added her own perspective. "Sometimes, the ugliest things that happen to us become the seeds of the most beautiful things we can do for others." When they finally rose to go inside, Ethan looked one last time at the swamp where his life had been forever transformed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, calls from world leaders, decisions about new projects, the responsibilities of a growing global movement. But today he was simply grateful. Grateful for the second chance he didn't deserve, grateful for the family he had reclaimed, grateful for the opportunity to transform the worst mistake of his life into the foundation of something beautiful and lasting. The bayou remained serene under the starry sky, its waters reflecting the full moon that gently illuminated the houseboat, where 3 generations of a family had learned that it's never too late to start over, never too late to change, and never too late to transform wounds into wisdom and mistakes into opportunities to serve something greater than ourselves. And so, the story that began with abandonment and betrayal ended with redemption and hope, not just for one family, but for a world that had discovered that true sustainability is only possible when we recognize our fundamental interdependence and our shared responsibility for the future of the planet we all call home. End epilogue. 10 years after the Nobel ceremony, the Bayou Protocol had been adopted by more than 300 projects in 67 countries. Ethan, now retired from active leadership, spent his days writing books on ethical leadership and sustainability, always citing Arthur, Mama Rosie, and Maya as his primary teachers. Arthur lived to be 92, passing away peacefully one spring morning while watching the birds in the lagoon that had become his sanctuary. His last words were,